Welcome back to Climate Change Perspectives. Professor, let's start off with you. Let's look at the notion of failed states and obviously some of the risks that we see when we see a failure from an economic perspective, and how that then also changes things significantly from a climate change perspective.
We're looking more to the future for this. The most recent climate change models indicate that in very large parts of the tropics and subtropics will undergo very big weather changes and will undergo an asymmetric increase in heating. Most of the global warming will actually affect the tropical and subtropical land masses and the near Arctic rather than the oceans. The effect of this is also going to be to change weather patterns, so you may get much more larger problems of floods and also droughts in different parts of the world. The weather will become more extreme. Now, the impact of that on states which are already weak, where the ecological carrying capacity of the land to support crop production diminishes, means that weak states can turn into failed states, and people simply become desperate either within their own states or trying to migrate. So it's not that climate change as of now is causing huge problems, although there are indications, as was remarked earlier, that in Northeast Africa it's linked. It's something for the future, but it really links in very much with the fragility of state structures, and those become almost unsustainable if you have climate change having its real impact, as is now, I think, pretty confidently predicted within 20 years or so.
Yeah, and imagine that this would also probably compound the issue of the transboundary movement of populations. Yes. And if you take South Africa in the recent past, where it may have been seen as economic refugees, but if this is amplified by the impacts of climate change, and we know that South Africa had to deal with outbreaks of xenophobia, what happens, it creates within states that are as stable as South Africa, not necessarily failed states, the opportunity for social unrest.
Indeed.
And how does this extend to the small island states, for example, Tom?
Well, here you have, a country like the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, which is only a few feet above sea level. It might not have a large population, but if sea levels rise, as we are given to understand, as the ice packs in the Antarctic and the Arctic melt, these states are going to disappear, and those people are going to go somewhere. There's not only the Maldives, but also the small island states in the Pacific, large numbers of those. All those people's livelihood and future is at risk, and the number of states are going to a number are going to disappear. The number of states in the world are going to be reduced, but their populations have got to find somewhere else to live.
Absolutely. Yeah. Professor, just a very interesting point. When you look at China, for example, massive and rapid urbanization occurring at such a fast pace that one can't even really keep up with some of the new trends that are emerging. But while this is happening, we're also starting to see that agricultural land, of course, is being urbanized. And this also comes down to food security, for example. But it is impacting climate because pollution is increasing rapidly as well. And there's millions of people there that will need to be fed, and perhaps food security comes down to climate change as well. So it's all really linked in together, isn't it?
It is, and China is a very interesting case. I mean, it is a country which, while it embraces elements of the free market, has very strong central planning. The Chinese have become very much aware in the last 5 to 10 years that they themselves will experience huge problems of food production if climate change really goes out of control. And they have the problem of trying to satisfy a population which has very strong economic aspirations. China, interestingly, is now going very heavily into renewables. It's the world's largest producer of photovoltaic panels for direct transfer of sunlight into electricity. It's actually installing more wind power every year than the entire installed wind capacity in Britain, in spite of our offshore farms. So the Chinese, I think, have become aware at a state level of the seriousness of this. But going back to your earlier point, I think the issue in a sense is the biggest single responsibility lies with the industrialized states. They have to make a transit to low carbon economies very rapidly. The states that are in earlier stages of development will need to find and be helped to find lower carbon paths to development. That is not going to be easy, but it's not impossible, and there have been some incredibly good technological developments. I mean, I'm speaking from a house in the north of England. We have a photovoltaic array on the roof of this house, 3.8 kilowatt. all the electricity supply, the lights, in fact, to supply the Skype that I'm talking you through is actually supplied from the sun today, and I'm exporting electricity to the grid. Now, that kind of system can be applied, and the key thing is it's becoming cheaper and cheaper. It would not have been economical 10 years ago. It is very nearly economical now. But this is, in a sense, an indication of the different paths of development that are going to need to be taken. But one can only expect that if the states responsible for the major part of the problem, the industrialized states, actually are prepared to go down the path of transiting to low-carbon economies.
Listening to you, Paul, there's a question that begs, and that is, then why don't we get a sense that COP17 is going to be successful or something? That we are grabbing at straws at the moment? Is this because of a lack of commitment? Or, do you feel?
I have to say it is a lack of commitment on the part of the major industrialized states. You're simply not getting the degree of international political leadership that is demanded by the nature of the potential climate change crisis. If anything, I think there is less interest than at the time of Copenhagen. And that is extremely worrying and a sign that we need a real transition. It's going to be very difficult to see major progress in Durban. One of the most important things that could happen, purely if I may be sort of selfish from a personal perspective in the north, is a much louder voice from the south demanding of the industrialized states that they have to change. There's every right to do so, and that may just help in a very small way to get the kind of wake-up call. There are many activists, there are many people trying to make the changes in the north, but they're not having much impact at the moment, and I think Durban can serve a very good purpose if it sounds an extremely loud wake-up call. But it is against the odds, I have to accept that, and it is not an easy time. It's very easy to get pessimistic.
Yeah, Tom, do you feel the South African government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will be the president to the conference, do you feel South Africa has offered sufficient leadership in the run-up to COP post-Cancun? And are you optimistic that we could get something coming out of Durban?
I'm not optimistic, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to your question, but I know that there is a tremendous amount of NGO activity around Durban. Our own institute is hosting a series of events there, including a youth summit, where a youth protocol will be drafted by school learners, which will be presented as a means of trying to press the parties to move forward. I think this problem is very well understood in this country, but it's a question of the short-termism, the short-term benefits for the parties, particularly in the industrialized north, to look after their short-term interests rather than to look at this long-term problem that we all face.
But
Professor, just if I could just point on one thing, and it's quite easy to say that the industrialized nations, and we're talking on Europe and the US predominantly, to of course take responsibility in a sense, but they're dealing with their own sets of problems. We've got the Eurozone in economic dire straits, if we could call it that. And this is really testament when you see the carbon credit prices plunging significantly. I know of many South African corporate companies that aren't able to sell their carbon credits at this point in time because prices have plunged so extensively, and they're really worried about the overall carbon trade going forward. So we're starting to see quite a bit of lack of commitment already because of the economic woes that are going on in the developed nations.
I think that's absolutely true. Since 2008, with the first crisis then, and certainly what has happened over the last 4 to 5 months, that is what comes to the fore in any discussions on international political economy. There are, though, both activists and analysts who are saying that if you're going to go for any kind of investment to get Western Europe out of the current recession, the area to put that investment into is the broadly based green industries, moving to low carbon industries, because they're quite labor intensive if they are also high tech. And there are now strong arguments that in fact when you have investment trying to raise the level of employment, you'd focus it on that kind of area. And that actually in some ways kills two birds with one stone, in that you're putting investment into better employment, but you're doing it in a way which is looking to the future. Now, I have to say that that is a fairly shrill voice at the moment, But there are people starting to say that, and in one or two parts of Europe, some countries or even regions, they're actually putting that into practice. But I have to say we're still in the early stages of that, but it is an aspect of the debate here.
Yeah, but from my reading of the situation, I think that the hope that popular pressure, look at the protestation against Wall Street and how it's been put down, and to assume that the populations who are angry and fed up that governments are not doing enough, I wonder if they have sufficient clout to compel the governments and the heads of delegation in Durban to actually take action on climate change and take action now. We know the science notwithstanding the difference of opinion on it, but isn't there, don't you feel, what is your feeling?
Well, I suppose
Tom?
the problem boils down in the end to who has the greatest economic power to influence the politicians. Is it the large businesses that are creating the emissions, or are it these activists? Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I think you're right that those that fund the campaigns of politicians have more clout with them than the activists out on the street, whether in Wall Street or on the streets of Durban.
Professor, you're the Professor of Peace Studies, as I mentioned, at the University of Bradford. So when you look at a lot of the wars that are going on, some would say that they're resource wars in a sense. We've got water wars perhaps that are going on in Africa. It's so fascinating because if you link a lot of the unrest that we see, it can be linked to one commodity or the other. What is your prognosis? Are we going to see more wars ensuing down the line when it comes to resources as a whole?
There is a risk of that. I think always the most important region geopolitically remains the Persian Gulf because of its huge oil and gas reserves. In the longer term, I think as pressures on land become more extreme, if climate change is allowed to kick in seriously, then under those circumstances you will see more conflicts and more social unrest related directly to climate change. Of course, it does not have to be that way at all. I certainly agree on the point that you're not getting the level of public protest that you need. But what I think is worth saying is maybe two things. One is there is evidence that the impact of climate change is going to become more and more obvious over the next 5 to 10 years, not least because of the frequency of more extreme weather events. What is also true is there's some very good work now being done on how advanced industrialized economies can go seriously low carbon.
Yeah.
The work of the New Economics Foundation in London with its Great Transition Project is an example of this. So I think in a sense over the next 5 to 10 years there's some small scope for cautious optimism because it will become obvious that climate change has to be tackled, and some people will have already thought out how best to do that.
Yeah.
Couple with that with probably very impressive technological developments, particularly far more efficient use of renewables, and we may begin very tentatively to have the answer. But I'm not in any way pretending it's going to be easy, and I think the next 4 or 5 years are going to require a lot of resilience on the part of those people who are saying that this is one of the key issues for the 21st century.
Tom, let's end off with you. Last thoughts.
I think there's a major problem ahead for all of us.
Are you cautiously optimistic?
Well, let me be cautiously optimistic.
On that note, gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us. Great to have you on the program. On that note, we've come to the end of this week's edition of Climate Change Perspectives. Thank you so much to our guests, Thomas Wheeler and Professor Paul Rogers. From me, Eleni, Giokos, and my co-host, Daniel Kinnear. Thank you so much for watching.